The doctor looked at the billionaire's pregnant wife's ultrasound showing twins and begged him to divorce her immediately, claiming the babies couldn't possibly be his. What Edward Tucker chose to do instead left the entire world in shock. Hi, my beautiful family. May the Almighty fill your hearts with peace, blessings, and unshakable joy. Before we begin this journey together, I need just 10 seconds of your time. If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you're part of my beautiful family already, show your love with a like. Now let's dive into Edward and Caroline's story, a story that will remind you what true wealth really means. In a world obsessed with numbers and net worth, the rarest fortune is one loyal heart, and Edward Tucker was about to discover whether he truly owned one. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tucker penthouse had watched a decade of billion-dollar deals, ruthless negotiations, and quiet loneliness. Tonight, they would watch the beginning of a battle that would decide whether love or legacy would survive. Edward Tucker stood at the edge of his living room, 47 stories above the glittering city, hands in his pockets, staring at news tickers flashing his company's name across 3 digital screens. At 33, he commanded Tucker Global, a tech logistics empire that moved goods across 6 continents, employed 40,000 people, and made him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. Presidents returned his calls. Competitors studied his strategies. The world saw a man who had everything. But Edward Tucker knew the truth. He was running out of time. The silver-framed photograph on his desk showed his late father, Robert Tucker, in his final year. Still sharp-eyed, still unforgiving. The man who'd built Tucker Global from a single warehouse had left his son everything, except freedom. One clause in the will haunted every decision Edward made. Remain married and produce a legitimate heir within 2 years of your father's death, or controlling shares transferred to the board. 23 months had already passed. Edward had 1 month left. Still thinking about that ridiculous will clause, Edward? The voice cut through the silence like expensive perfume wrapped around a blade. Victoria Tucker entered from the terrace, martini in hand. Silver hair swept into a perfect chignon that matched her perfect suit and perfectly controlled smile. At 58, Edward's aunt had mastered the art of looking elegant while sharpening knives. She'd been acting board chair since Robert's death, managing his shares in trust, while Edward fought to meet the conditions. She'd also made it very clear she believed the company would be better off without him. Edward's shoulders tensed. I'm thinking about my wife. Oh, yes, Caroline. Victoria settled into the leather chair as if she owned it, which technically, in 1 month, she might. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. 2 years of marriage and still no announcement. How unfortunate for a company that depends on stability and legacy. The board is asking questions, Edward. Difficult questions about your commitment to the Tucker name. The words landed exactly where she aimed them. Tucker Global wasn't just logistics and profit margins. It was infrastructure, supply chains, and technology that kept hospitals stocked, disaster relief moving, and entire industries functioning. Robert Tucker had built something that mattered, and his will ensured it would only continue through blood and marriage. His way of forcing Edward to build a family instead of hiding behind screens and spreadsheets? Victoria had watched that will like a hawk from the moment it was read. She'd married into the Tucker family 30 years ago, raised her son Daniel in Robert's shadow, and believed she'd earned a share of this empire through decades of dinner parties and charity galas. When Robert gave everything to Edward instead, she'd smiled at the funeral and started planning. Caroline and I are working on it, Edward said quietly, hating how defensive he sounded in his own penthouse. Working on it. Victoria savored each word like fine wine. Such a clinical phrase. Some women, Edward, simply aren't built for this life. Perhaps she's too fragile, too ordinary, a nurse playing dress-up as a billionaire's wife. She paused, letting the cruelty sink in. The board would understand if you needed to make a different choice. For the company's sake, of course. Before Edward could respond, the private elevator chimed, announcing another arrival. Daniel Tucker stepped into the penthouse with the easy confidence of someone who'd been taught since childhood that he deserved this view, this life, this empire. At 35, Victoria's son had the Tucker jawline. An MBA from Wharton, and the CFO title Edward had given him to keep peace in the family. He also had his mother's talent for smiling while calculating your weaknesses. Edward! Daniel's voice boomed with false warmth as he crossed the room, pulling his cousin into a brief performative embrace. I was just telling Mother how terrible I feel about the pressure you and Caroline must be under. The board meeting next month, the will clause ticking down like a bomb. It's enough to destroy any marriage, no matter how strong. Edward studied his cousin's face, searching for sincerity and finding only the same cold ambition that lived in Victoria's eyes. The two people who smiled the widest at family dinners. The two people who would gain the most if Edward lost everything. And standing between him and disaster was Caroline, the woman who'd once held his hand in a hospital room and told him his life mattered more than his money. The woman carrying his children. The woman a trusted family doctor would soon tell him had betrayed him with lies wrapped in lab results and genetic charts. 3 weeks earlier, Edward Tucker's morning began the way every morning had for 2 years, staring at a calendar that felt more like a countdown to execution than a schedule. His corner office on the 52nd floor of Tucker Tower commanded a view of the entire city, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, but Edward barely saw it anymore. Instead, he saw the digital clock in the corner of his screen. 29 days until board review. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Mr. Tucker, the logistics team is ready for the Singapore call, and your aunt confirmed brunch at the Penthouse this Sunday. Edward's jaw tightened. Victoria never confirmed anything without a reason. The Singapore call lasted 90 minutes. Supply chain optimization, new distribution hubs, profit projections that would make shareholders smile. Edward navigated it flawlessly, the way he always did. Numbers made sense. Logistics had rules. Business rewarded preparation and intelligence. Marriage and fatherhood, apparently, did not. After the call, he opened the quarterly report Victoria had sent that morning. Buried in page 47, highlighted in yellow, was a single line. Board expresses concern regarding leadership succession planning and compliance with testamentary conditions. Translation: Tick-tock, Edward. Where's your heir? He closed his laptop harder than necessary. The truth was, Edward had spent 2 years trying to build something his father never gave him. A marriage based on love instead of strategy. Caroline wasn't a merger. She wasn't a calculated risk. She was the woman who'd stayed by his hospital bed after his emergency appendectomy 3 years ago, talking to him like a person instead of a stock ticker, making him laugh through morphine haze. She was also the woman his family had never stopped reminding him didn't belong. That Sunday, the penthouse filled with the kind of forced elegance that made Caroline's hands shake. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the catering staff arrange imported cheeses and champagne flutes, feeling like an imposter in her own home. Her simple blue dress, bought off the rack, not custom designed, suddenly felt too plain, too ordinary, too nurse for a Tucker family brunch. Mrs. Tucker, should we set out the caviar now or wait? The head caterer asked. Now is fine. Thank you. Caroline smiled, but her voice sounded small even to her own ears. She caught her reflection in the chrome espresso machine. Brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail, minimal makeup, the same face that used to comfort patients in the ICU. That face didn't belong on magazine covers or charity gala posters. It belonged in scrubs under fluorescent lights, doing work that actually mattered. Caroline, darling! Victoria's voice rang out as she swept into the penthouse, Daniel trailing behind her. You look comfortable. How refreshing. The word comfortable landed like an insult wrapped in silk. Victoria. Daniel. Thank you for coming. Caroline forced brightness into her tone. Wouldn't miss it. Daniel kissed her cheek, the gesture cold and performative. Edward says you've been planning this brunch for weeks. Philanthropic strategy, right? Though I'm sure you have other news to share too. His eyes dropped meaningfully to her stomach. Caroline's hand instinctively moved to her midsection before she caught herself. Just excited to discuss the new hospital wing project. Of course. Victoria settled into the dining chair like a queen claiming a throne. Though one does wonder about priorities, hospital wings are lovely, but the Tucker legacy requires more personal contributions. Wouldn't you agree? Edward entered from his office, tension visible in his shoulders. Victoria, can we eat before the interrogation? Interrogation? Victoria laughed, light and cruel. I'm simply concerned about family. You do remember what family means, don't you, Edward? Blood, legacy, the very things your father's will requires. The brunch became a carefully orchestrated torture session disguised as small talk. Between bites of smoked salmon and asparagus, Victoria asked about Caroline's family. Teachers and civil servants? How noble. And Daniel mentioned a Tucker cousin who just announced her third pregnancy. Strong genes in our line. Some women are built for carrying on great names, Victoria mused, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Others, well, not everyone can handle the pressure. There's no shame in admitting incompatibility. Caroline is my wife. Edward's voice went dangerously quiet. That's not changing. Of course not, dear. Unless the board forces your hand. Victoria's smile never wavered. 29 days is such a short time to produce a miracle, don't you think? Caroline felt the room tilt slightly. The champagne, which she hadn't touched, the rich food, the perfectly conditioned air that suddenly felt too thin. She pressed her hand against her midsection again, this time because a wave of dizziness threatened to pull her under. Excuse me, she managed, standing too quickly. I need to... Edward was on his feet instantly, his hand on her elbow. Caroline? I'm fine, just tired. She forced a smile, but her skin had gone pale, a fine sheen of sweat on her forehead. For a moment, Edward looked at her, really looked, and saw something shift in her eyes. Something fragile and fierce and desperately hopeful that she was trying to hide. Victoria, Daniel, I think we're done here. Edward's voice left no room for argument. As Victoria and Daniel gathered their things with knowing smirks, Caroline excused herself to the bathroom, hands still pressed to her stomach, carrying a secret that would either save them or destroy them completely. Edward watched her go, his billion-dollar mind calculating risks and probabilities, never imagining that in 72 hours, a doctor he'd trusted his entire life would convince him that the miracle he'd been praying for was actually his worst betrayal. The most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in charts, lab coats, and a voice that says, "Trust me, I'm your doctor." Caroline sat alone in the waiting room of Tucker Family Medical Center, hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. The private clinic smelled like expensive leather and anxiety disguised as privilege. Nothing like the ICU where she used to work, where fear was honest and help was immediate. Here, even the magazines were intimidating. She'd told Edward she had a routine checkup. Not a lie exactly, but not the whole truth either, because telling him she might be pregnant again, after last time, felt like handing him hope she wasn't sure she could protect. 18 months ago, she'd miscarried at 9 weeks. Edward had held her through the loss, but Victoria's voice had echoed in the hospital room even when she wasn't there. Some women simply aren't built for this. Mrs. Tucker? A kind-faced sonographer appeared in the doorway. We're ready for you. The ultrasound room was dim and cold. Caroline lay back on the table, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would show up on the monitor. The sonographer squeezed gel onto her abdomen, still flat, still hiding whatever truth was growing inside, and pressed the wand against her skin. Static filled the screen, gray shapes that meant nothing to Caroline, but everything to the woman reading them. Then, a flicker, a tiny, rapid pulse of light. The sonographer's face broke into a smile. There's baby A. She moved the wand slightly. And there's baby B. Caroline's breath stopped. 2? Congratulations, Mrs. Tucker. You're having twins. The tears came before Caroline could stop them. Grateful, terrified, overwhelmed tears that soaked the paper covering the examination table. 2 heartbeats, 2 miracles, 2 reasons the Tucker family could never again call her inadequate. As the sonographer printed images, Caroline let herself imagine it. Walking into Edward's office, handing him the ultrasound photo, watching his face transform from exhaustion to pure joy. He'd lift her off her feet, kiss her forehead, whisper that she'd just saved everything that mattered. Victoria and Daniel would have to accept her then. The board would stop circling. The will clause would lose its teeth. They would finally be safe. 3 floors above the ultrasound room, Dr. William Gregg stared at Caroline Tucker's test results with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. At 62, he'd been the Tucker family physician for 3 decades. He delivered Edward, treated his father's heart condition, and built a reputation as discreet, competent, and utterly trustworthy. He'd also developed a gambling problem that had cost him everything but his medical license. His phone vibrated. Another text from an unknown number. Foundation representative here. Your payment is overdue. We expect cooperation on the Tucker matter as discussed. Consequences for refusal will be severe. Greg's stomach twisted. He'd borrowed money from the wrong people. People connected to foundations, boards, and family members who smiled in boardrooms while destroying lives behind closed doors. The deal was simple. Deliver specific findings about Caroline Tucker's pregnancy or lose everything. His finger hovered over Edward's contact. One call, and he'd cross a line he could never uncross. He made the call. Edward, this is William Gregg. I need you to come to my office immediately. Alone. Don't bring Caroline. Edward arrived within the hour. Tie loosened, worry etched across his face. Is Caroline all right? Is something wrong with... Sit down, Edward. Dr. Gregg's voice was too formal, too controlled. He spread charts across the desk like evidence at a trial. Hormone levels, gestational dating, genetic markers typed in neat columns that Edward's business mind instinctively tried to interpret. I'm going to be direct because you deserve the truth. Dr. Gregg met Edward's eyes, perfecting the lie he'd rehearsed 100 times. The twins Caroline is carrying were not conceived during any window when you were in the country. According to gestational age, conception occurred during the 2 weeks you were in Switzerland for the merger negotiations. Edward's world tilted. That's impossible. I've triple-checked the numbers. Edward, the genetic preliminary markers are inconsistent with your stored DNA profile from your annual physicals. I've sent samples to 3 independent labs, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Stanford. They all confirm the same findings. The words landed like physical blows. Switzerland. 2 weeks. He'd been gone for business while Caroline had been home, alone, supposedly waiting for him. You're telling me... I'm telling you that these children are not biologically yours. Dr. Gregg slid a genetic comparison chart across the desk, pointing to highlighted discrepancies that Edward couldn't possibly understand, but looked damningly official. The markers suggest European Asian heritage inconsistent with Tucker genetics. Edward's mind raced through memories, searching for signs he'd missed. Late-night phone calls Caroline took in the other room, appointments she attended alone, the way she'd been so secretive about this pregnancy, insisting on coming to the clinic by herself. If the board discovers this before you act, Dr. Gregg continued, his voice heavy with manufactured regret, they'll accuse her of fraud. They'll say she tried to pass off another man's children as Tucker heirs to secure your inheritance. Your reputation, the company, everything your father built, it will all collapse in scandal. What are you suggesting? Divorce her quietly. Claim irreconcilable differences. Protect yourself and the Tucker name before this becomes public. Dr. Gregg's hands were steady now, committed to the performance. I'm sorry, Edward. I know you love her. But the science doesn't lie. Edward left the office, clutching a manila folder full of charts and lies. His brilliant mind, so good at solving logistics and market problems, struggling to process the impossible data in front of him. Behind him, Dr. Gregg sat alone in his office, staring at his phone, wondering what he'd just done to save himself. And somewhere in the city, Caroline Tucker sat in a coffee shop, hand on her stomach, composing a text to her husband. Edward, I have the most wonderful news. Can we talk tonight? A woman's greatest power isn't in her tears, but in the way she keeps loving when everyone has already judged her guilty. Caroline spent the afternoon turning their private dining room into something that felt like hope instead of obligation. No caterers, no imported champagne, no pretense. Just 2 tiny white baby socks laid carefully on Edward's placemat, an ultrasound photo in a simple silver frame, and a handwritten note on cream stationery, our double miracle. She stepped back, studying the arrangement, and felt her eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall. This was supposed to be joy, pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind she used to see on new fathers' faces in the ICU maternity ward before she married into a world where even pregnancy felt like a performance review. Her mind drifted back 3 years, to the night everything changed. She'd been working a double shift when the ambulance brought in Charles Tucker. Chest pains, possible cardiac event, a 70-year-old man surrounded by assistants shouting orders into phones. But it was his son who caught her attention. Edward Tucker had stood against the wall, perfectly still, eyes fixed on his father while the world spun around him. When Caroline approached to explain the treatment plan, she hadn't seen a billionaire. She'd seen a terrified man trying to hold himself together. "Your father's stable," she'd said simply. "The next 6 hours are critical, but he's strong." Edward had looked at her like she'd offered him oxygen. "Thank you for," he gestured helplessly, "for talking to me like I'm human." She'd smiled. "That's because you are." He'd stayed at the hospital for 4 days. They'd talked during her breaks about everything except money, power, and the Tucker name. When Charles recovered, Edward asked for her number. 6 months later, he proposed in that same hospital cafeteria, saying she'd saved his life by reminding him it was worth living. The memory felt fragile now, like something she had to protect from Victoria's poison and the board's scrutiny, and from the darker memory that still woke her up at night. 18 months ago, she'd started bleeding at 9 weeks. The emergency room doctor's face had told her everything before the words came. Edward had held her through the loss, but at the funeral, Charles insisted on holding, because even grief required Tucker grandeur. Victoria had cornered her in the powder room. "Some women simply aren't built for carrying Tucker blood," Victoria had said, adjusting her lipstick in the mirror. "No shame in admitting your limitations, dear." Caroline had wanted to scream that bodies weren't failures, that loss wasn't weakness, that she was more than a vessel for someone else's legacy. Instead, she'd whispered, "I'll try again." "Will you?" Victoria's reflection had smiled. "Or will you finally accept that you were never meant for this family?" Now, staring at the ultrasound photo of two perfect heartbeats, Caroline felt vindication burning in her chest. Not weakness, not failure. Life. Edward arrived home at 9 p.m., tie loosened, shoulders carrying weight that hadn't been there that morning. "Edward," Caroline moved toward him, concerned. "Are you okay? You look fine. Just a long day." His voice was flat, distant, like he was reading lines from a script. Caroline took his hand and felt him stiffen before forcing his fingers to relax around hers. "I have something to show you. Come with me." She led him to the dining room, watching his face as he registered the socks, the frame, the note. "Caroline." "Twins, Edward. We're having twins." Her voice broke with happiness she couldn't contain. "I saw them today. 2 heartbeats. 2 miracles." Edward picked up the ultrasound photo, staring at the grainy images like they were evidence at a trial instead of their children. "When," he cleared his throat, "when exactly did they say conception was?" The question landed wrong. Too clinical, too careful. "About 8 weeks ago." "Why?" Carolyn searched his face, finding something cold where there should have been warmth. "Edward, aren't you happy?" "Of course. Yes, this is..." He pulled her into a hug, but his body was rigid, mechanical. "This is wonderful news." But it wasn't. She could feel it in the way he held her, like she was breakable, or dangerous, or both. His next questions came rapid fire. What was the exact date of her last period? Had she been tracking her cycle? Was she absolutely certain about the timing? Each question drove a knife deeper into her joy. "Edward, what's wrong?" Her voice came out small, broken. "You're acting like this is a problem instead of a miracle." "Nothing's wrong. I'm just processing." He kissed her forehead, the gesture empty. "I need to make some calls. Excuse me." He left her standing alone in the dining room, staring at the baby socks that suddenly looked like accusations instead of promises. That night, Edward lay on his side of the bed, eyes open, staring at shadows on the ceiling, while Dr. Gregg's charts played on repeat in his mind. Conception timing, genetic inconsistencies, Switzerland. Beside him, Caroline curled around a pillow, one hand resting on her still flat belly, whispering promises Edward couldn't hear. "I don't know what's happening, but I will protect you, both of you, even if I have to do it alone." In the darkness between them, Doubt grew like a wall, built by lies neither of them knew were there. Truth doesn't fear investigation, only lies insist you accept them without a second look. Edward couldn't focus. The quarterly projections presentation might as well have been in another language. His CFO, Daniel, was talking about market expansion and supply chain optimization, but all Edward heard was Dr. Gregg's voice. The science doesn't lie. Except Edward had built an empire on data, and data always told a story if you knew how to read it. Edward? Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts. You seem distracted. Is everything all right at home? The boardroom went quiet. 6 executives all suddenly interested in their coffee cups, pretending they weren't listening. Everything's fine. Edward forced his attention back to the spreadsheets. Of course. Victoria's smile was surgical. Though if you ever need to discuss difficult personal matters, the board understands that sometimes marriage requires difficult decisions, especially when the company's future is at stake. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Edward like a predator measuring prey. Mother's right. We're family, Edward. Whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to face it alone. The words were supportive. The tone was calculating. After the meeting, Victoria cornered Edward at the elevator. I know that look, she said quietly. That's the face of a man who's discovered something he didn't want to know. Edward's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Women from modest backgrounds, Victoria continued, as if he hadn't spoken, sometimes panic when they realize they don't belong. They make choices, terrible choices, trying to secure what they think they deserve. She placed a manicured hand on his arm. If Caroline has done something unfortunate, I want you to know the board would support you. We'd keep it quiet, protect the Tucker name. You wouldn't have to sacrifice everything for someone who betrayed you. Edward pulled her arm away. Caroline is my wife. For now. Victoria's smile never wavered. But loyalty has limits, Edward. Even yours. Back in his office, Edward locked the door and pulled out his phone. Not to call a divorce attorney, not to confront Caroline, to call Freddie Moreno, his college roommate, now a forensic accountant who specialized in finding money people didn't want found. I need you to audit someone, Edward said without preamble. Dr. William Gregg, Tucker family physician, and I need you to trace every dollar connected to Tucker Medical Foundation and any associated shell organizations. Quietly. How quietly? No one can know. Not the board, not the family. No one. Freddie paused. Edward, what's going on? I'm either about to prove my wife is innocent or discover that everyone I trust is lying to me. I need to know which. The report came back in 6 hours. Edward read it twice, his stomach sinking with each page. Dr. William Gregg had gambling debts totaling $340,000 across 3 casinos. Large, desperate withdrawals over the past 18 months. And then, 2 weeks before Caroline's ultrasound, a deposit of $150,000 from Tucker Medical Foundation Consulting Services. The foundation was technically independent, but its board chair, Victoria's longtime associate, its primary donor, a trust fund controlled by Daniel. Edward pulled out Dr. Gregg's medical report, spreading the pages across his desk under the harsh LED light. He wasn't a doctor, but he was brilliant with numbers and patterns. And now, looking with suspicion instead of trust, he saw them. The date stamp on the genetic analysis was 3 days before Caroline's ultrasound. Impossible unless they'd run tests before she even walked in the door. The gestational age was rounded to exactly 8 weeks. No days, no precision. Just a convenient number that placed conception during his Switzerland trip. The signature on the Johns Hopkins confirmation looked slightly different from the Mayo Clinic one. Same name, but the loop on the G was inconsistent. Edward's hands shook as he reached for his phone again. This time, he called a maternal fetal medicine specialist in a different state, someone who had no connection to Tucker money or Tucker politics. I need an appointment under a false name, he said, and I need you to review raw ultrasound data and lab work. No identifying information, just the science. The scheduler hesitated. Sir, that's highly unusual. I'll pay whatever it costs, but no one can know who I am or why I'm asking. Can you do that? Another pause. We have an opening tomorrow at 6 a.m. before regular hours. Bring everything in a sealed envelope. Cash only. Edward hung up and stared at the medical file that had nearly convinced him to divorce the woman who'd saved his life. Truth doesn't fear investigation, he thought. Only lies do. If Caroline was innocent, if this was all manufactured, then someone had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy his marriage. Someone with money, access, and motive. Someone who stood to gain everything if he lost his heir. Edward looked at the door to his office, thinking of Victoria and Daniel somewhere in this building, smiling their perfect smiles, waiting for him to make the mistake they'd planned for him. Tomorrow he'd know the truth. Tonight he had to go home and face Caroline. Knowing he'd doubted her, knowing he'd let someone plant poison in his mind, and knowing she had no idea how close he'd come to destroying them both. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who sit at your family table and pretend they're worried about you. Caroline noticed the silence first. The penthouse staff, people who used to greet her warmly, who remembered how she took her tea, now stopped talking when she entered rooms. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes dropped to floors. The warmth that once made the glass and steel tower feel almost like home had frozen into something cold and watchful. "Has anyone seen Maria?" Caroline asked the new housekeeper, a stern woman who'd appeared 3 days ago. "She usually works mornings." Mrs. Lucas reassigned her. "Other instructions?" The woman didn't meet Caroline's eyes. "Mrs. Lucas." Caroline's stomach dropped. "Victoria doesn't manage the household staff." "She does now, ma'am." The housekeeper turned away, ending the conversation. That afternoon, Caroline asked the driver to detour to Dr. Reeves' office, her trauma therapist, the woman who'd helped her process the miscarriage and the terror of trying again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Tucker, but I have strict instructions to follow the approved route only." The driver's eyes stayed fixed on the road. "Approved by whom?" "Building security, ma'am." Caroline's hands clenched in her lap. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a grown woman with every right to see her own doctor. But arguing felt dangerous in ways she couldn't name. She took a taxi instead, paying cash, feeling ridiculous for the secrecy, but unable to shake the sensation of being watched. Dr. Dr. Reeves listened as Caroline explained the growing distance with Edward, the cold staff, the feeling that her own home had turned hostile. "Have you told Edward?" Dr. Reeves asked gently. "He's under so much pressure. The board, his father's will, Victoria circling like—" Caroline stopped, hand on her belly. "I don't want to add to his burden. These babies are supposed to be joy, not another problem to solve." After the appointment, Caroline stopped at the high-risk OB clinic across town, her backup doctor, chosen precisely because she had no Tucker connections. She kept every receipt, every appointment card, storing them in a folder hidden in her old nursing textbook, just in case she ever needed proof she'd done everything right. The gossip blog post went live at 10 p.m. Billionaire's wife spotted entering luxury hotel, secret rendezvous while husband travels. Grainy photos showed Caroline entering the boutique hotel where Dr. Reeves' office was located. Another showed her at the private medical building. The timestamps, carefully chosen, matched days Edward had been traveling for business. The comments section filled with speculation about affairs, gold diggers, and women who married for money. In Victoria's penthouse study, she and Daniel reviewed the security footage on her laptop. "The hotel photo was perfect," Daniel said, pouring himself scotch. "No one needs to know her therapist works there." Victoria smiled. "And the medical building visit looks appropriately suspicious. Plant enough doubt and Edward will do our work for us." "Men always believe evidence over emotion." "Think he'll file for divorce before the deadline?" "He's already questioning her. I saw it in his eyes at the meeting." Victoria closed the laptop. "We just need to let the poison work." Caroline found Edward in his office, staring at his phone. "Have you seen anything online about me?" Her voice was small, afraid of the answer. Edward looked up, his face carefully neutral. "It's all noise, Caroline. Don't worry about it." But his eyes flickered with something that looked like doubt, and Caroline felt her world shift beneath her feet. That night, while Edward worked late, Caroline called her old nursing friend Jessica, the only person left who knew her before she became Mrs. Tucker. "Jess, I need you to know something." Caroline's voice shook. If anything happens to me, if they try to say I did something wrong, I need you to know I've been faithful. I've been careful. I've done everything right for these babies. Caroline, you're scaring me. What's going on? I don't know, but I feel like I'm being watched, like they're building a case against me. She pressed her hand to her belly. Just remember, okay? Whatever they say, I loved Edward. I loved these babies. And I did everything right. Across the city in Tucker Family Medical Center, a young sonographer named Amy Jacobs sat alone in the records room, Caroline Tucker's file open on her desk. She'd overheard Dr. Gregg's tense phone call with Victoria 2 weeks ago, heard words like, alter the dates, and make it convincing, and she'll never know. Amy stared at the file, at the raw ultrasound data that told a very different story than Dr. Gregg's official report. Her hands trembled as she inserted a flash drive into the computer. Some truths were too important to bury. There are two kinds of destruction, the one that comes from enemies and the one you do with your own hands by believing them. The Tucker Foundation Gala was Victoria's masterpiece. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, the event drew 500 guests, business leaders, politicians, media executives, and everyone who mattered in Edward's world. The banner read, "Celebrating Family Values and Ethical Innovation." Victoria had personally briefed 3 gossip bloggers that Edward Tucker would make a shocking announcement about his personal life. The trap was set. Caroline stood in front of the bedroom mirror, struggling with the zipper on her emerald gown. The slight curve of her belly, barely visible but undeniably there, made the dress fit differently than it had at the fitting 2 weeks ago. She pressed her hand against the swell, smiling at her reflection. "Tonight might be the night," she whispered to the twins. "The night your father tells the world you exist. The night we stop being a secret and start being a family." She imagined Edward's speech, introducing her, announcing the pregnancy, watching Victoria's face crumble as the will clause lost its power. The fantasy felt fragile, but she held it tight. The ballroom glittered with crystal and ambition. Caroline felt the chill the moment she entered. Cameras turning her direction, whispers following her movement, forced smiles that didn't reach eyes. Women she'd met at charity events suddenly found reasons to look away. Men watched her with speculation that made her skin crawl. Edward stood across the room in a cluster of board members, his jaw tight, shoulders rigid. When their eyes met, he looked away. Caroline's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. Edward saw Caroline enter, saw her hopeful smile falter when she registered the atmosphere, and wanted to cross the room and pull her away from all of it. But Victoria's hand landed on his elbow first. "A word, Edward. Backstage. Now." In the service corridor behind the stage, Victoria spread printed evidence across a catering table like weapons. The gossip blog photos, Dr. Gregg's medical report, and a memo from 3 board members demanding an emergency meeting about leadership stability and air legitimacy concerns. "They know, Edward." Victoria's voice was urgent, almost sympathetic. "Or they suspect. Either way, if you don't control this narrative tonight, the board will. They'll vote no confidence, remove you, destroy the company your father built." She stepped closer. "You have to announce the divorce. Frame it as mutual, dignified. Protect Tucker Global before this scandal breaks." "She's pregnant with my children." Edward's voice was raw. "Is she?" Victoria's eyebrow arched. "Are they? Because Dr. Gregg's science says otherwise. And when that truth comes out, and it will, the company won't survive the fraud allegations." Edward's mind raced through impossible calculations. 40,000 employees depending on Tucker Global's stability. His father's life work, the legacy he'd sworn to protect, against the memory of Caroline in a hospital corridor, still in scrubs, telling him, "Your life matters more than your money. Don't ever forget that." "I saw the independent analysis," Victoria pressed. "I know you sought a second opinion. What did they tell you, Edward? Did they confirm what we already know?" Edward's appointment had been that morning. The specialist had reviewed the raw data and, "Mr. Tucker?" A stage manager appeared. "You're on in 2 minutes." Victoria's eyes gleamed. "Choose, Edward. The woman or the empire, but choose now." Caroline stood at the edge of the stage, hands protectively over her belly, watching Edward emerge from backstage with Victoria trailing behind him. His face was pale, distant, like a man walking to his own execution. The room fell silent as he stepped to the podium. 500 faces turned toward him, cameras raised, phones positioned to record whatever shocking announcement Victoria had promised. Caroline's heart hammered. Please, she thought, please choose us. Edward gripped the podium, looked out at the crowd, then found Caroline's eyes across the distance, and opened his mouth to speak. Truth may arrive late, but when it appears, every lie in the room starts to tremble. The night before the gala, Edward sat in a cramped medical office 3 hours outside the city, where no one knew his face and his money meant nothing. The maternal fetal specialist, Dr. Sarah Kim, was reviewing Caroline's raw ultrasound data on a laptop, her expression growing darker with each screen. Walk me through it, Edward said quietly. Pretend I know nothing. Dr. Kim pulled up side-by-side images, the official report from Dr. Gregg, and the raw ultrasound metadata. This measurement here, crown rump length, puts conception at approximately 9 weeks ago. Not 8. Edward's breath caught. 9 weeks? I was home 9 weeks ago. Exactly. And this hormonal progression, she traced the graph with her finger, shows a natural, healthy twin pregnancy with conception occurring during this 3-day window. She circled dates on a calendar. Were you with your wife during these dates? Edward remembered. Caroline had surprised him with dinner after a brutal board meeting. They'd stayed up talking until dawn, her telling him stories from her nursing days, him laughing for the first time in months. Yes, I was with her. Then these are your children, Mr. Smith. Dr. Kim used the fake name he'd given. No question. But the official report says, the official report has been altered. Dr. Kim pulled up metadata timestamps. Look at these date stamps. Someone backdated lab entries, rounded gestational age to force a different conception window, and manually adjusted hormone values. This isn't a medical mistake. This is fraud. The word hung in the sterile office like a verdict. Edward's hands shook as he stared at the screen. He'd been hours away from filing divorce papers, from publicly calling Caroline a liar, from condemning his own children as illegitimate, all because he'd trusted a doctor with gambling debts and a family with ambitions. Why would someone do this? Dr. Kim asked softly. Edward's laugh was bitter. 20 billion reasons. He drove home in silence, the specialist's flash drive burning in his pocket like evidence at a crime scene. Instead of going to the penthouse, Edward went to his father's estate, the mansion where he'd grown up, now maintained but empty since Charles's death. He let himself in with the key he still carried, moving through dark hallways to his father's study. The safe was behind a painting of the Tucker family 3 generations back. Edward worked the combination, his mother's birthday, the one sentimental thing his father had ever done, and pulled out files, stock certificates, and a sealed envelope with his name written in his father's handwriting. To be opened when you understand what family truly means. Edward's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Edward, if you're reading this, someone has tried to destroy your marriage. I suspect Victoria, though Daniel is equally capable of treachery. The heir clause in my will was never about bloodline. It was a test. I needed to know, when your relatives inevitably turned against your wife, because they will, would you choose her, or would you choose the empire they've convinced you matters more? Tucker Global is just a company. Buildings, contracts, and stock prices. It can be rebuilt, sold, or lost without destroying what truly matters. But a woman who loves you despite your money, children born from that love, that cannot be replaced. The people who smile around your boardroom table will be the first ones to erase her. They will use science, gossip, and board votes to convince you she doesn't belong. They will make you doubt her because your doubt serves their ambition. Don't let them win, son. Choose love, even if it costs you everything else. The empire isn't your legacy. The man you become when tested, that's your legacy. Dad Edward read the letter 3 times, his father's voice echoing in every word. Victoria had done exactly what his father predicted, used medicine as a weapon, planted doubt, positioned herself to inherit when Edward failed the test. Except he wasn't going to fail. The next night, standing backstage at the gala with Victoria demanding he announce his divorce, Edward had already made his choice. He would not protect the empire by sacrificing Caroline. He would protect Caroline by exposing the empire's rot, even if it cost him everything. Especially if it cost him everything. Because his father was right. Tucker Global was just a company. But Caroline and the twins she carried were his only real fortune. Edward stepped onto the stage, looked at his wife standing at the edge with her hands over their children, and prepared to burn down everything his family had spent 3 generations building. For the first time in his life, he felt truly wealthy. Truth is a double-edged sword. It cuts the liar, but it also cuts the one who chose to believe the lie. Caroline didn't remember leaving the gala. She remembered Edward's voice at the podium, unexpected and defiant. "I will not be making any announcements about my marriage tonight. My wife Caroline stands accused of nothing, because she has done nothing wrong. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." She remembered the stunned silence, Victoria's fury, the way Edward had walked off the stage, taken Caroline's hand, and led her out while cameras flashed and the room erupted in chaos. But she also remembered that he hadn't explained, hadn't shown proof, had simply refused to divorce her while 500 people watched him choose her over their expectations. It wasn't enough. Not yet. The apartment was in a modest building 20 minutes from Tucker Tower. Caroline had rented it 2 years ago, when Victoria's cruelty first made her realize she might need an escape plan. A small one-bedroom with furniture from discount stores and windows that overlooked a bodega instead of a skyline. It was the first place that had felt like hers in years. She stood in the tiny kitchen, one hand on her belly, trying to make sense of what had happened. Edward had defended her, but he hadn't told them why, hadn't shown them proof. The gossip blogs were already spinning narratives. Billionaire blinded by love, and Tucker chooses wife over empire. But at what cost? "I don't know what to do," she whispered to the twins. "He defended us tonight, but tomorrow Victoria will come back harder. The board will demand answers. And if he doesn't have proof, real proof, they'll destroy all of us." Her voice broke. "I can't survive another betrayal. I can't keep hoping he'll choose us if he's just going to let them win in the end." A soft knock made her spin around. Edward stood in the doorway, still in his tuxedo, holding a folder that looked too heavy for its size. "How did you—" "Your old nursing license. It listed this address." His voice was exhausted. "I should have come here first instead of the gala. Should have shown you everything before standing up there." "What's in the folder?" Edward entered, spreading papers across her small kitchen table. Medical reports, bank statements, text messages between Dr. Gregg and Victoria. Proof of conspiracy laid out like evidence at trial. The independent specialist confirmed the twins are mine. Victoria paid Dr. Gregg $150,000 to fabricate everything. I have paper trails, testimony, and enough evidence to file criminal charges. He looked up, eyes red. "I defended you at the gala, but I didn't expose them because I wanted you to see this first. I wanted you to know I believe you, not because of proof, but because I should have trusted you from the beginning." Caroline stared at the evidence, her hands shaking. "You really thought I—" "For about 12 hours, yes. And I will regret those 12 hours for the rest of my life." Edward's voice cracked. "I almost destroyed everything because I let them poison my mind. I'm so sorry, Caroline." She crossed the room and hit his chest. Not hard, but desperate. "You should have trusted me." "I know. I loved you when you had nothing but fear." She hit him again, tears streaming. "I married you, not your empire." "I know." He caught her hands, holding them against his heart. "And tomorrow I'm going to prove it. I'm holding a press conference. I'm exposing Victoria, Dr. Gregg, all of it. And then I'm resigning as CEO. Caroline froze. "What?" "I'm putting my shares in a blind trust for our children and walking away. Any empire that demands I sacrifice you isn't worth ruling." His voice was fierce. "I need you beside me tomorrow, not to save the company, but so the world sees that we face the lies together, that I chose you over everything." "Edward, you'll lose everything." I'll lose buildings and bank accounts, but I'll have you, and grace and justice. He touched her face gently. That's the only wealth that matters. Caroline studied his face, seeing the man she'd fallen for in that hospital corridor. Vulnerable, honest, willing to lose everything for love. Okay, she whispered. Tomorrow we tell the truth. Together. Together, Edward agreed. And in that tiny apartment, they prepared to face the world. Not as a billionaire and his wife, but as two people who'd chosen each other over an empire. The greatest victories are not won in boardrooms, but in the moment a man chooses love over the throne offered to him. Every major news outlet predicted the same headline. Tucker CEO to announce divorce, salvage empire. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Tucker Tower's main auditorium. By 9:30, every seat was filled. Investors clutching tablets showing plummeting stock prices, employees whispering about layoffs, journalists positioning cameras for the perfect shot of a billionaire's fall from grace. Victoria sat front row center, black suit perfectly tailored, rehearsed sympathy arranged on her face like a mask. Beside her, Daniel scrolled through his phone, already planning his acceptance speech as interim CEO. 3 rows back, Dr. Gregg sat rigid, confident that Edward Tucker would do what powerful men always did, protect his empire at any cost. They were all wrong. Edward stepped onto the stage at exactly 10 a.m., Caroline beside him in a simple blue dress, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her belly. The room fell silent. Thank you for coming. Edward's voice was steady, businessman calm. I know there have been rumors about my personal life, concerns about leadership stability, questions about my marriage and my commitment to Tucker Global's future. Victoria's smile widened almost imperceptibly. This was the script she'd written. These concerns have been amplified by medical reports suggesting complications regarding my wife's pregnancy and questions about paternity. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in on Caroline's face. Edward pressed a button, and the screen behind him lit up with medical charts. Dr. Gregg's official report in bold letters. This is the report that was presented to me by our family physician, Dr. Gregg, claiming the children my wife carries could not possibly be mine. Dr. Gregg sat straighter, vindicated. Then Edward pressed another button. And this, a second report appeared beside the first, is an independent analysis of the raw ultrasound data by Dr. Sarah Kim, a maternal fetal specialist with no connection to Tucker money or Tucker politics. The room leaned forward as Edward walked them through it, pointing to timestamps, altered values, and fabricated conception dates. His voice never rose, never wavered. He simply presented the truth like the businessman he was. Someone tampered with my wife's medical records to frame her as unfaithful. Someone paid our family doctor to lie. Edward turned, looking directly at Dr. Gregg. Dr. William Gregg received $150,000 from Tucker Medical Foundation 2 weeks before my wife's appointment. That foundation is controlled by my aunt, Victoria Tucker, and my cousin, Daniel Tucker. The room erupted. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. Victoria's mask cracked. I've filed criminal complaints for fraud, conspiracy, and medical malpractice. Edward's voice cut through the chaos. The authorities are already investigating. Security moved toward the front row. Dr. Gregg stood, looking for exits. Daniel grabbed Victoria's arm, both their faces drained of color. But Edward wasn't finished. I'm also announcing my resignation as CEO of Tucker Global, effective immediately. The room went silent again, this time in shock. My shares will be placed in a blind trust controlled by a neutral firm until my children, Grace and Justice Tucker, are old enough to make their own choices. My wife, Caroline Tucker, will serve as their guardian and legal protector. Edward, you can't. Victoria's voice rang out, desperate now. I can, and I am. Edward looked directly into the cameras, speaking to the world watching live. My father's will was meant to test whether I valued legacy over love. I failed that test when I doubted my wife. I won't fail again. He took Caroline's hand, intertwining their fingers in front of hundreds of witnesses. Any empire that demands I sacrifice my wife and children is already bankrupt. Any throne built on lies and manipulation isn't worth sitting on. His voice softened. Caroline and our twins are my only real wealth. Everything else is just numbers on a screen. Behind them, police officers entered through side doors. Victoria stood, backing away as an officer approached with handcuffs. Dr. Gregg was already being escorted out, his medical career ending in a perp walk broadcast live to millions. The auditorium dissolved into chaos, board members shouting, journalists scrambling, investors fleeing. But Edward and Caroline stood still in the center of it all, hands locked together. The world watched a billionaire choose love over everything. And somehow, in losing his empire, Edward Tucker became the richest man in the room. Real legacy is not written in annual reports, but in the names your children carry and the love they grow up surrounded by. 9 months later, the Tucker name no longer meant skyscrapers and board meetings. It meant a small coastal house with chipped paint and a porch swing that creaked in the salt air. It meant Edward Tucker, former Billionaire'S CEO, wearing jeans and helping elderly Mrs. Kathy from next door carry groceries. It meant Caroline Tucker, former ICU nurse, back in scrubs, volunteering at the community clinic Edward had quietly funded with what remained after legal fees and restitution. The clinic served families who couldn't afford Tucker Family Medical Center's marble lobbies and astronomical bills. No one bought diagnoses here. No one lied for money. It was the kind of medicine Caroline had always believed in. Mr. Tucker, the ultrasound machine you donated arrived. The clinic director beamed. 3 pregnant mothers are scheduled this week. You've changed lives here. Edward smiled, but his attention was on Caroline across the room, one hand pressed to her lower back, her face tightening with discomfort she was trying to hide. Caroline, he crossed to her in 3 strides. Is it? Contractions. Started an hour ago. She tried to smile. I was hoping to finish my shift first. Your shift is over. Edward's voice left no room for argument. Dr. Patel, we need the delivery room. The television in the waiting area played muted news. Victoria Tucker's fraud trial entering its 4th week. Dr. Gregg's medical license permanently revoked. Tucker Global under new leadership after a massive restructuring. Edward glanced at the screen, then deliberately looked away. That world didn't matter anymore. Caroline's labor lasted 6 hours, long enough for Edward to remember every choice that had led them here. The moment he'd almost believed lies over love. The folder full of fabricated evidence he'd nearly used to destroy his family. The empire he'd thought mattered more than the woman holding his hand. I'm sorry, he whispered during a contraction, for doubting you. For letting them stop. Caroline squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. You chose us when it mattered. That's what counts. At 6:47 a.m., as sunrise painted the delivery room golden, Grace Elizabeth Tucker entered the world crying with fierce, healthy lungs. 4 minutes later, Justice Tucker followed, calmer but just as perfect. Caroline sobbed with relief as nurses placed both babies on her chest. 2 miracles that had survived lies, conspiracy, and a family determined to erase them. Edward's hands shook as he touched their tiny heads, overwhelmed by how close he'd come to never knowing them. Grace, Caroline whispered, kissing their daughter's forehead, for the mercy we were given. Justice, Edward added, his voice breaking, for the truth that saved us. The names were a manifesto, a quiet declaration that they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. As the sun rose higher outside the clinic window, Edward held his son while Caroline cradled their daughter, and for the first time in his life, he understood what wealth actually meant. You know what this is? Edward looked around the modest delivery room, so different from the luxury suites his money could have bought. This is the only boardroom that will ever matter to me again. The only empire worth building. Caroline smiled through tears. What a strange empire. The best kind, he kissed her forehead, built on love instead of stock prices. Grace and Justice's tiny hands curled around their parents' fingers, unaware of the conspiracy that had tried to prevent their existence. Unconscious of the fortune their father had surrendered to claim them, knowing only the warmth of being wanted, chosen, and loved. Remember the doctor who saw the ultrasound and demanded divorce? He'd accidentally triggered the most important decision Edward Tucker would ever make. Because when forced to choose between an empire and love, Edward discovered what his father had tried to teach him all along. A man with a loyal wife and children he adores is wealthier than any billionaire who sits alone on a throne of lies. Edward Tucker had finally become truly rich. The end. My beautiful family, if you stayed with me until this very moment, you have my deepest gratitude. You just witnessed a story about choosing love over everything. And by watching to the end, you chose to honor the work I poured into this for you. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button right now. If you felt Edward's struggle, if you cried with Caroline, if you celebrated when truth won over lies, then this story deserves your like. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have chosen love over a $1 billion empire? Comment love over everything if you would walk away from it all for the right person. And if you're new here, subscribe and join this family because every week I bring you stories that don't just entertain, they remind you what truly matters in life. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. Share it with someone who's fighting their own battle against people who don't believe in them. Share it with someone who needs hope. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. You are the reason I create. Until the next story, may you always choose love over lies, family over fortune, and truth over everything else. I love you, my beautiful family. See you in the next one.